Our final speaker in this session is Richard Harrison. Richard is one of the directors at NIAB, where he leads agricultural crop research. He has a PhD in systems biology, and his study was where next for the soft fruit industry. He also tells me that he once enjoyed traveling, writing, and presenting, but he's changed his mind. Richard, over to you.
Thank you very much. Your Royal Highness, Lords, ladies and gentlemen, my scholarship has focused on asking questions about the future of horticultural production, and I hope that my findings will be useful in addressing the current major challenges that exist around sustainable production of nutritious, high-quality horticultural crops. Now, you'll all be aware that this year the media coverage of the climate crisis and the ensuing debate around mitigating humankind's impact on the planet rose to prominence once again. And this global reawakening after a decade of stagnation really parallels my personal journey over the past 2 years as well. So I started my Nuffield thinking that the path for increasing yields in strawberry would be a reasonably simple case of embracing the approaches taken in tomato production. But what I realized was that if a sustainable path is to be pursued, then a total rethink is required. And I'm convinced that the UK can rise to this challenge and be a global leader in sustainable food production. Today, I'll present you 3 conclusions and aligned recommendations from my study, but first, I'd like to set the scene a little. It may be obvious, but there are an abundance of free energy sources arising directly or indirectly from the solar energy that reaches the Earth. Now, every year, around 89,000 terawatts, where a terawatt is a million watts. And think one of those light bulbs is maybe 10 or 20 watts. That power hits the land and the sea every year and is absorbed, and it's mostly re-emitted. Photosynthesis, in totality, captures around 95 terawatts of that energy. That's just 0.1% of the solar energy that hits the Earth every year and converts it to biomass at around an efficiency of 3 to 6%. Humanity consumes around 17 terawatts of energy every year. And in Europe, we directly consume around 3.75 terawatts of energy, and we import a large amount of products which require high levels of energy to produce. So globally, energy demand is going up. And if we carry on as we are, we will use 50% more energy per capita by 2050. And that's in large part due to the rapidly developing global economies requiring more energy to enhance the lives of their populations. In the UK, per person, per day, we consume enough energy to make 5,000 cups of tea per person per day, or if we convert that into calories, that's the calorific equivalent of 112 Big Macs per person per day. And we each have the energy footprint of around 9 Stone Age people. That's a lot. And although massive strides have been taken in decarbonising our electricity production, only 15% of our energy use is for electricity. And globally, 80% of our energy demands are met by fossil fuels. So we still have a long way to go to reduce our dependency on fossil fuel. And if we are to steer a course towards net zero by 2050 and net negative emissions beyond that, then globally emissions must halve by 2030. The enormity of this challenge cannot be understated. So focusing down onto some of the key drivers structuring our current food system, the increasing global demand for food, the increasing variability of our weather due to climate change, and the abundance of cheap fossil fuel across the supply chain are all really important factors. And within the horticultural sector, we see a rapidly changing retail market, extreme price pressure, dwindling and expensive labour pool, and weather-induced supply chain shocks, leading a shift in demand towards reliable, automated, protected growing systems. And as consumers, our demand for year-round supply of fresh fruit and veg is growing, and our changing lifestyles mean that we demand much more elaborate ways of consuming pre-prepared food, and our fragmented lifestyles mean that often good food is wasted. Now, through my Nuffield visits, I saw lots of strawberry production. Travelling around growers in South Africa, I could very well have been in Kent, as the systems were identical, but crucially, the environmental impacts were not. Water scarcity is a far greater issue in South Africa, even than in Kent, and the emissions in air freight alone of fresh produce from South Africa to the UK lead to 5 kilos of CO2 being emitted for every kilo of fruit that's transported. But of course, balanced against this is the huge level of societal good that strawberry growing businesses have contributed to in South Africa, lifting many people out of poverty. And if we consider indoor production in Europe, we can see a picture where for indoor tomato production, yield per unit area increases by around 4-fold compared to outdoor production, but energy use increases by 175-fold. And that's currently perfectly economically viable. And in 2012, where there happens to be particularly good data, it meant that Dutch tomato production used around 22% of the total energy of UK agriculture and led to around 7% of the emissions scaled to the total in that year from UK agriculture. However, it's very important to note that this could also be seen as a resounding success of the circular economy, because much of the energy that's used is a waste stream, as we heard this morning, from combined heat and power systems. And so the question arises, to whom and to what should emissions be apportioned, to tomatoes or to electricity? Well, what I hope we can all agree is that we need to rapidly transition from fossil fuel-based systems to other renewable systems, and doing nothing is not an option. And this will likely mean that many of the waste streams that we currently use start to disappear, and therefore alternative, economically viable sources of energy need to be found if we wish to continue intensive horticultural production close to the source of demand. So what levers can we pull? Well, this leads to the key conclusions and recommendations of my study. Conclusion 1, genetics is an easy way to make environmentally sustainable yield gains, and we have more tools than ever before, and the UK is well placed to lead in this area. And in strawberry, I believe that we could increase yields up to around 2.5 kilos per plant, which, when you couple that with the most intensive growing systems currently on the market, give theoretical yields of around 500 tonnes per hectare. Now, that's roughly a 20-fold increase from the national average, a 10-fold increase from standard glasshouse production, and a 5-fold increase from the current bleeding-edge production systems. So industry continuing to fund the breeding pipeline that takes fundamental research into practice is crucial. However, the acceleration in innovation and the shift in emphasis that we need to develop varieties that don't necessarily match current market demands is going to be challenging. And so the UK government should consider directly funding breeding or pre-breeding for future crops, because this is unlikely to be met by near-market industry funding, but could play a really big role in decarbonisation of intensive food production. Conclusion 2. Energy consumption in agriculture is rising in some sectors, and new production systems must design to avoid increasing this and be developed with an awareness of wider energy policies and system changes, for example, the transition to smart grids. Simply moving production systems that exist already into other crops, like strawberry, that haven't yet been improved for yield won't work in the short term, because the energy costs are prohibitive and just exacerbate our decarbonisation challenges. Now, based on current intensive systems, strawberries use 3 to 10 times the amount of energy, kilo for kilo, of a corresponding tomato crop, due to the much lower yields of strawberry per unit area. But with enhanced varieties, developing systems that increase production intensity while switching to economic renewable sources of energy increases both productivity and sustainability. So in the case of strawberries, it may actually even be possible to lower the level of energy inputs below that of current field production. And crucially, intensification alters the land area that you need for production dramatically. If we took our 500-ton a hectare crop, we would reduce our annual entire strawberry crop to from around 4,200 hectares to around 280 hectares, unlocking options for land use change. So recommendation 2, multidisciplinary approaches to system design are needed, and greater awareness, training and tools are needed to design net zero systems. And these systems, to the extent that they currently exist, are currently high risk and high cost for all but the bravest or the wealthiest. And as well as the need to improve future systems, current practice must be evaluated to avoid increasing emissions through scaling of current unsustainable production practices. Conclusion 3, it's currently really hard to say what's good and what's bad in system design in terms of the wider impacts. And so things like lifecycle analysis are really badly needed to quantify these negative externalities of production. Now, Lifecycle Assessment is a cradle-to-grave framework which attempts to estimate the environmental impact of a product, say a kilo of strawberries, by taking into account the impact of both the inputs into the system and the outputs as they flow through the supply chain. I would argue that environmental modelling is needed at the whole farm level and must encompass the energy system, because this can have profound implications on the sustainability and feasibility of the system. Now, in my introduction, I told you that photosynthesis was only 3 to 6% efficient at harvesting solar energy. Now, contrast that with solar panels, which have efficiencies in some cases now approaching 30%, and we can begin to understand how, depending on whether biomass or solar is used to power a greenhouse, we can observe a 26-fold difference in the area of land that's used for energy generation. So with the caveat that these results are very crude and a first approximation, in a scenario of production of a high-energy, high-input strawberry crop, 500 tonnes per hectare, the land for solar that you would need is roughly equal to that of the crop, so around 297 versus 277 hectares. And when you combine that together, that's only 13% of the current land area used for strawberries. However, in a low-yield case, to maintain our current level of production, an intensive system would take around 60,000 hectares of biomass, or 2,467 hectares of solar. And note, the biggest proposed single area of solar in the UK, at Cleve Hill in Kent, is only around 400 hectares. So recommendation 3, expanded lifecycle analysis, not only to chart the end-to-end costs of our current supply chains, but to model new sustainable scenarios is important, and we must use a basket of metrics to evaluate that. And government can play a key role in facilitating this through enabling more research. But beyond this, more effort is needed in linking this data to real-time, multi-scale models, digital twins, and that's needed to explore and model a wider range of supply system options in silico on the computer. This will help de-risk investment decisions, because the role of private capital in building the future is going to be essential. So in summary, genetics to improve efficiency, design systems to avoid emissions in the first place from fossil fuels, and better systems and environmental modelling using real-time data and a basket of metrics. But of course, none of this would be possible without a strong connection to policy and the recognition that we as consumers all need to play our part and be nudged in the right direction. So I now wish to embed some of the concepts that we've learned more widely into the crop science discipline, and this will require new science, multidisciplinary partnerships, and above all, both governmental and industry champions like the many Nuffield scholars that I'm now proud to call my friends. And with that, I'd like to thank my sponsors, the Worshipful Company of Fruiterers and Gardeners, my work, my family, my wife Nikki, my daughter Millie, son Thomas, my mum Therese for lots of help with childcare, and finally, the wider Nuffield family for their help and support. Thank you.